So I was going to wait until July to begin our summer schedule here of, the bonus DVDs and covering the old comics and going into the making of books, and particularly the Star Wars Archives by Paul Duncan. If you haven't seen my interview with Paul Duncan that I've done on the channel, you can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, as well as the live video version, the original one, here on the channel. Anyways, the Star Wars Archives are two massive books that honestly will take you months to get through each one. And one covers the prequel trilogy and the other covers the original trilogy, with many interviews with George Lucas, and updated ones, mind you. So today we're going to start off where George is discussing episode 1. We're going to start at the very beginning, then we'll cover as much as we can with episode 1, then we'll move to episode 2, and by the time Ahsoka comes out, we should probably be done all the way up to episode 6 is my goal. So in today's video, we're going to cover how George Lucas admits that Obi-Wan is to actually blame for Anakin's downfall, the fall of the Jedi, and really to blame for everything. So here we go. In this interview, this one is coming from September 7th, 1996. And if you haven't checked out the Star Wars Archives by Paul Duncan, I highly recommend it. He just published a much smaller and concise and cheaper version for those who want to grab that. But I have the larger, fully stacked one, and I gotta say, this is something that I've had for a few years now, and I still haven't gone through even 50% of it. And you guys know how much content I've covered from that book. And if I had to choose one video in particular that I covered from that book that I absolutely cherish, it's the sequel trilogy treatment from George Lucas's mouth himself, which is an interview that Paul Duncan had with George personally, and I asked him about it during the interview I had with him in 2018, or maybe even 2019, if my memory betrays me. But that video in itself goes through all of George Lucas's plans for the sequel trilogy, as well as the extended information I received from Paul Duncan during our interview together. You can find both videos or episodes on the channel, as well as on Spotify and Apple iTunes. So make sure to check that episode out after today's. Anyways, so this is 3 years before The Phantom Menace comes out, and George Lucas is talking about the differences between Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi. And he says when you're writing a story, you often want to have two opposing characters, kind of, on the same side, but he says it like this. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan disagree about using what one would call, in mythological terms, the guide. One believes in the guide, the other one doesn't. When you are walking down the street and the beggar's on the street, one character takes the beggar along with them on the trip, and the other one says, "Why are you doing this? This is going to slow us down. This is not a wise thing to do." The first one says, "Yes, but this beggar is useful to us." It's a classic mythological motif, but at the same time, it's conflict. The characters have to grow, so what happens is that eventually the character that is very much against doing this has the obligation transferred to them. And we see this all the time in Star Wars, primarily Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. We see it with Jar Jar Binks, and then again we see it with Anakin Skywalker, where Obi-Wan tells Qui-Gon, "Why do I have the feeling we picked up another pathetic life form?" Going back to George, he continues, "In this case, we have Qui-Gon, the mentor, who takes on Anakin, and the Padawan Obi-Wan, who thinks this is a bad idea. So we've got a dynamic between these two Jedi. At the end of the film, Obi-Wan takes on the obligation to train Anakin, one that he can't really fulfill because it's over his head. His inability to train this kid properly turns Anakin into Darth Vader and drives the rest of the stories. Not only does he let his mentor down, but it plays into the collapse of the Republic. This is why he feels obligated to try to rectify the situation with Luke. One of the reasons people connect to Star Wars so much is because the psychology of it is very old. Whether it's knights in armor or Greek warriors or Western gunslingers, you're always telling the same story where you combine the larger cosmic and spiritual issues with the temporal issues of who you are and what your limitations are." George then goes on to criticize the current filmmakers and says that, "I'm amazed people aren't telling these stories anymore. People have forgotten about the reason you tell a story. They just seem to tell it without any point to it." And we see that today. It's very evident with all of the CGI in movies and, even Star Wars going forwards, and you may disagree with this, but I know a lot of people do agree that there is a major issue going on with Disney having controlled Lucasfilm and Kathleen Kennedy. I think the way George created Star Wars and his stories in general was very organic, it was very old school, and it just worked. And it was downright just very simple. Now, back to the topic, and I'll reiterate what George said. At the end of the film, Obi-Wan takes on the obligation to train Anakin, one that he can't really fulfill because it's over his head. So right there we see from George's mouth that Obi-Wan really wasn't fit to be training Anakin at that time. And I always thought this too, the first time I saw The Phantom Menace, even at 9 years old. I remember when Yoda and the Council weren't really ready to grant Obi-Wan his rank of Jedi Knight. It was all kind of forced, no pun intended. Once Qui-Gon died, he made him promise to train the boy, and Obi-Wan basically gave the ultimatum to the Jedi Council, to Yoda, saying that I will train the boy, and that even means if I have to leave the council as a Jedi, leave the Jedi Temple, I will still train the boy and fulfill my promise to Obi-Wan. So basically Yoda saw it as, well, we could either govern him and kind of control him and make sure that he's on the path to training the boy properly, even though this boy has a lot of issues and a lot of things to clean up and fix, such as his attachments and fear and anger, or we can just let Obi-Wan go and he's going to train Anakin, and we don't know what will happen to him. We may not be there to facilitate and help. To be honest, if Obi-Wan had left the council and just trained Anakin and fulfilled his promise to Qui-Gon, I think things would have probably ended up better, to be honest. George goes on to say his inability to train this kid properly turns Anakin into Darth Vader and drives the rest of the stories. Not only does he let his mentor down, but it plays into the collapse of the Republic. This is why he feels obligated to try to rectify the situation with Luke. So right there, Obi-Wan is literally the guy who destroyed the entire Star Wars galaxy, at least for that timeline where Vader and the Emperor ruled. And then when it came to Luke, he was trying to fix what he messed up with Anakin, but then ended up kind of dying. I always loved these little snippets and inserts from George. I really love covering these books. I hope you guys are ready for the pretty quick but epic summer we're about to have in terms of content here on the channel. There's going to be lots of these that we're going to be covering, a ton. And I'll be uploading some exclusive ones on the Star Wars Theory podcast on Apple, iTunes, and Spotify, as well as all other major podcast platforms. I truly believe that if Qui-Gon had survived, he would have been the one to be able to save Anakin and to save the Jedi Council and the galaxy for that matter. I don't think Anakin would have turned, and I really don't think that Obi-Wan was fit to take care of Anakin. There were so many moments that Anakin could have succeeded in many different endeavors and excelled, but I feel like Obi-Wan held him back due to his own fear that Anakin would advance too quickly and maybe become too powerful and it wouldn't be controlled. I think there was a lot to learn when it came to the prequel trilogy with a lot of the characters that many people gloss over, and I hope that these videos and the excerpts from this book, which I hope you guys check out, will shed a lot of light on it. Thanks so much for watching today's video. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, remember, the Force will be with you always.